Christmas has always been my favorite holiday. The lights, the food, the feeling of belonging somewhere warm, while the world outside turns cold and dark. So when my boyfriend Kevin invited me to spend the holiday with his family in their farmhouse outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, I thought it would be perfect. We had been dating for about 8 months, and things were getting serious enough that meeting the whole extended family felt like the natural next step. I remember packing my suitcase that Thursday morning, carefully wrapping the gifts I had bought for his parents and his 2 sisters, feeling nervous but excited. My own family had scattered across the country after my parents split up when I was finishing college back in 2015, so the idea of a big traditional Christmas dinner with a real family felt like something out of a movie. Kevin kept telling me how much they would love me, how his mom made the best honey-glazed ham, how his dad would probably fall asleep in his recliner after dessert like he did every year. I believed every word. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon on December 23, 2023. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by flat, frozen fields that stretched out in every direction, like an ocean of brown and white. It was bigger than I expected, a 2-story wooden structure painted pale blue, with a wraparound porch decorated with string lights and plastic candy canes. There were already 5 or 6 cars parked in front when we pulled up, and I could see shadows moving behind the frosted windows. Kevin squeezed my hand and smiled before we got out. The cold hit me immediately, that sharp Iowa wind cutting right through my coat. His mother, a heavy-set woman named Darlene with silver hair pinned up in a bun, opened the front door before we even reached the porch steps. She hugged Kevin for a long time, rocking him back and forth like he was still a little boy. When she finally turned to me, her smile stayed in place, but something behind her eyes shifted. She looked me up and down slowly, then said, "So you are the one." Not, "Nice to meet you." Not, "Welcome." Just that. "So you are the one." Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and wood smoke, and the living room was packed with people. Kevin introduced me to everyone so fast that I could barely keep track of names and faces. His father, a wiry man named Donald with a gray mustache and deep-set eyes, shook my hand without saying a word. His older sister, Tammy, who looked like a harder version of Darlene, gave me a quick nod from across the room. His younger sister, April, at least smiled, though it faded the moment her mother glanced at her. There were aunts and uncles and cousins scattered around on couches and folding chairs, and every single one of them seemed to stop their conversations when I walked in. The Christmas tree in the corner was enormous, covered in what looked like decades' worth of ornaments, and above the fireplace hung a wooden sign that read, "Family first, family forever." I tried to make small talk with a few people, asking about their drive or commenting on the decorations, but every response I got was short and clipped. Kevin kept disappearing to help with things in the kitchen or to catch up with relatives he had not seen in months, leaving me alone in a room full of strangers who clearly had no interest in making me feel welcome. Dinner that first night was uncomfortable in ways I still struggle to put into words. We all crowded around a long table in the dining room, and Darlene made a point of seating me at the very end, as far from Kevin as possible. He was sandwiched between his sisters near the head of the table, and every time I tried to catch his eye, someone would lean in to talk to him or pass a dish that blocked my view. The food was good, I remember that much, but I could barely taste it. Conversations happened around me but never included me. At one point, Tammy said something about how Kevin used to bring home better choices in college, and the whole table laughed except for Kevin, who just stared at his plate. I waited for him to say something, to defend me, but he stayed quiet. After dinner, Darlene asked me to help clear the table while everyone else moved to the living room for coffee and pie. I spent 20 minutes alone in that kitchen, scraping plates and loading the dishwasher, listening to laughter coming from the other room. When I finally finished and went to join them, the conversation stopped the second I appeared in the doorway. Darlene looked at me with that same flat smile and said, "Oh, we were just talking about family things. You would not understand." That night, Kevin and I slept in his old childhood bedroom, a small room on the second floor with faded posters of basketball players still taped to the walls. I tried to tell him how I was feeling, how his family seemed cold toward me, how the comment at dinner had hurt. He sighed and rubbed his face and told me I was being too sensitive, that his family was just like that with new people, that I needed to give them time. He fell asleep within minutes, but I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house creak and settle around me. At some point after midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside our door. They stopped right in front of the room and stayed there for what felt like 5 full minutes before finally moving away. I told myself it was nothing, probably just someone going to the bathroom. But sleep did not come easy after that. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed about being trapped in a room with no doors while faceless people pressed against the walls, watching me. I woke up to gray morning light and the smell of bacon drifting up from downstairs. And for a brief moment, I let myself believe that maybe today would be different. Maybe they just needed to warm up to me. Christmas Eve started with breakfast in the kitchen, and I made an effort to be helpful and friendly despite how exhausted I felt. I offered to help Darlene with the cooking, but she told me she had it under control and that I should just stay out of the way. So I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while the women of the family bustled around me, talking to each other as if I was not even there. Around noon, more relatives started arriving, and the house grew louder and more crowded. I noticed that people kept having hushed conversations that would stop whenever I walked into a room. Kevin was no help at all. He spent most of the day outside with his father and his uncles, working on something in the barn, and every time I tried to go find him, one of his relatives would redirect me back inside with some excuse. By late afternoon, I had this growing sense of dread building in my chest, like something was coming that I could not see. The way they kept looking at me when they thought I was not paying attention. The way Tammy had started writing things down in a little notebook every time I said something. The way Donald had taken my car keys off the hook by the front door and slipped them into his pocket when he thought no one was watching. I saw it happen. I saw it and I said nothing because I kept telling myself I was imagining things. It happened after dinner, around 8 o'clock. We had just finished eating, and I was helping April carry dishes to the kitchen when Darlene appeared in the doorway and told me that the family wanted to have a conversation with me in the living room. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, but there was something underneath it that made every muscle in my body tighten. I followed her out, expecting maybe an awkward attempt at bonding or some kind of holiday tradition I did not know about. Instead, I walked into a room where every single member of Kevin's family was seated in a circle of chairs, and there was one empty chair in the middle facing all of them. The Christmas tree lights blinked red and green behind them, the fire crackled in the fireplace, and Kevin sat between his mother and his father, not looking at me. Darlene gestured to the empty chair and said, "Sit down, sweetheart. We need to talk about some concerns." My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and suddenly I was sitting in that chair, surrounded by 15 or 16 people all staring at me with expressions that ranged from cold to openly hostile. The front door was behind me, but when I glanced back, I saw that one of Kevin's uncles, a huge man named Bert with hands like dinner plates, had positioned himself directly in front of it. Tammy spoke first. She opened her little notebook and started reading from it like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom. She listed dates and incidents, things I had apparently done wrong over the past 8 months. The time I convinced Kevin to skip his mother's birthday dinner because we had concert tickets. The way I had been monopolizing his weekends so he could not come home to help with the farm. How I had changed his diet, his sleep schedule, his priorities. She said I was isolating him from his family, that I was manipulating him, that I was trying to turn him against the people who had loved him his whole life. Each accusation hit me like a punch to the chest. I tried to respond, tried to explain that Kevin had made his own choices, that we were building a life together in the city, that none of this was some sinister plan. But every time I opened my mouth, someone else would cut me off. Donald talked about how Kevin used to call home every Sunday, and now they were lucky to hear from him once a month. Darlene cried actual tears as she described how her baby boy was slipping away from her. An aunt whose name I never learned called me a snake. The word hung in the air like smoke. A snake. And through all of it, Kevin just sat there, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor and saying absolutely nothing. After about an hour of this, I finally found my voice. I stood up from the chair and said I was done, that I was not going to sit here and be attacked, that I wanted to leave. The room went quiet. Darlene exchanged a look with Donald, and then Donald reached into his pocket and pulled out my car keys. He held them up, letting them dangle from his fingers, and said, "You are not going anywhere until we finish this conversation." I asked for my keys back. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear it cracking. He just shook his head slowly, like I was a child who did not understand the rules. I turned to Kevin, begging him with my eyes to do something, to say something, to stand up and tell his family that this was insane. He finally looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw something like guilt in his expression. But then Darlene put her hand on his arm and whispered something in his ear, and he looked away again. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone in that house. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, maybe my friend Lisa back in the city, or even the police. But before I could even unlock the screen, Bert was standing right next to me. He did not grab me or touch me, but he leaned in close and said in this low, rumbling voice, "Put that away. We handle things the old-fashioned way in this family. You do not want to see what that means." The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. They made me sit back down in that chair, and one by one, each family member took their turn telling me everything that was wrong with me. My job, my clothes, the fact that I did not go to church, the way I laughed too loud, how I apparently looked at Kevin's father the wrong way at dinner. They had a whole list of conditions I would need to agree to if I wanted to stay with Kevin. I would need to move closer to the farm. I would need to attend Sunday dinners every single week. I would need to ask Darlene's permission before making any major decisions that affected Kevin. They had printed it all out on a piece of paper, like a contract, and Tammy slid it across to me with a pen. I stared at that paper for a long time. The fire had burned down to embers. The Christmas tree lights kept blinking their cheerful pattern. Outside, I could hear the wind howling across those frozen fields, and I thought about how far away the nearest neighbor must be, how no one would hear me if I screamed. I looked at Kevin one more time, searching for any sign that he would help me, that he would stand up for us. He would not even meet my eyes. So I picked up the pen, and then I set it back down and said, "No." The silence that followed was deafening. Darlene's face went from shocked to furious in the span of a heartbeat. She started to say something, but I did not let her finish. I stood up so fast that the chair tipped over behind me, and I started talking loud enough that my voice filled the whole room. I told them that what they were doing was insane, that holding someone against their will was a crime, that I would call the police the second I got out of there, and they would all have to explain themselves. I was shaking, my whole body trembling, but something inside me had snapped, and I was not going to let these people break me. I pointed at Donald and demanded my keys. I pointed at Bert and told him to get away from the door. And then I looked at Kevin, really looked at him, and I said, "If you do not stand up right now and walk out of here with me, we are done. Forever." The room held its breath. Kevin's face had gone pale, and I could see his jaw working like he was trying to chew through something tough. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood up. Darlene grabbed at his arm, but he shook her off. He walked over to his father, held out his hand, and said, "Give her the keys, Dad." Donald stared at him for a long moment, something ugly passing behind his eyes. But Kevin did not back down, and eventually, slowly, Donald dropped the keys into Kevin's palm. We walked out of that house together, and nobody tried to stop us. Maybe they were too shocked. Maybe they realized they had pushed too far. I do not know, and I do not care. The cold air hit me like a slap when we stepped onto the porch, and I had never been so grateful for anything in my life. Kevin drove because I was shaking too hard to hold the wheel. We did not talk for the first hour, Just drove through the dark Iowa night with nothing but fields and silence around us. When we finally stopped at a gas station somewhere near Des Moines, I got out and threw up in the parking lot. Kevin held my hair back and kept saying he was sorry, over and over, like a broken record. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him why he had not said anything sooner, why he had let it go on for so long. But I was too exhausted. We drove all night and made it back to the city by sunrise on Christmas morning. I spent the holiday alone in my apartment, eating cereal and staring at the wall, trying to process what had happened. Kevin and I tried to make it work for another few weeks after that. But something between us had shattered in that living room, and there was no putting it back together. I ended things in January, and I have not spoken to him since. It has been almost a year now, and I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had signed that paper, if I had given in, and let them mold me into whatever they thought Kevin deserved. Would I still be driving out to that farmhouse every Sunday, sitting at that long table, pretending to be someone I am not? The thought makes me sick. I learned something important in that living room, surrounded by people who had decided I was the enemy before I even walked through the door. I learned that some families are not built on love. They are built on control, on loyalty that looks more like fear, on traditions that exist to keep everyone in line. And I learned that no matter how much you want someone, no matter how much you think you love them, you cannot save a person who will not save themselves. Kevin made his choice when he sat there in silence and let them tear me apart. He made another choice when he finally stood up, but it was too late by then. The damage was done. I hope he is okay, wherever he is. I hope he eventually finds the strength to break free from that family for good. But that is not my fight anymore. I got out. And every Christmas since, I celebrate alone, with cheap wine and a movie and the doors locked tight. It is not the warm family holiday I used to dream about. But at least I am safe. At least I am free. Every year since I was a kid, December 24th meant the same thing. Chaos, laughter, and falling asleep to the smell of pine needles and cinnamon. But after what happened in 2023, that date now carries a weight I cannot shake. My wife Stephanie and I had just bought our first house in a quiet suburb outside Denver, Colorado. A split level with a big backyard where our two kids, Harper and Miles, could finally have room to run around. We had moved in during October, and I remember thinking how perfect it would be to host our first real Christmas there. My parents came over on Christmas Eve, along with Stephanie's sister and her husband. We did the whole thing: eggnog, caroling on the TV, the kids leaving cookies out for Santa. Everyone left around 11, and by midnight, Stephanie and I had finished placing all the presents under the tree. I was 34 that December, finally feeling like I had my life together, like I had built something worth protecting. We went to bed exhausted but happy, the kind of tired that comes from a good day spent with people you love. I woke up at 2:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I checked my phone the second my eyes opened, annoyed at myself for waking up when I had maybe 4 hours before the kids would come bursting into our room. At first I thought it was nothing, maybe just my body adjusting to the new house settling in the cold. But then I heard it again, a soft, papery rustle coming from downstairs. My first thought was Harper. She was 7 and had been talking nonstop about wanting to see what Santa brought. I figured she had snuck down to peek at the presents, maybe even started unwrapping one corner like she did last year at my parents' place. I slid out of bed slowly, not wanting to wake Stephanie, and walked toward the hallway in just my sweatpants and an old college shirt. I did not turn on any lights because I wanted to catch Harper in the act, maybe give her a little scare and send her back to bed with a warning. I moved down the first few steps, my bare feet silent on the carpet, and that was when I saw something that made every muscle in my body lock up. There was a man kneeling beside our Christmas tree. He had his back to me, hunched over the pile of presents, and he was using some kind of blade to slice through the wrapping paper with careful, deliberate movements. He wore dark clothing and a red Santa hat that looked absurd and terrifying at the same time, the white pom-pom bobbing slightly as he worked. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I thought maybe I was dreaming, or maybe one of our relatives had come back for something they forgot. But then the man shifted, and I saw the way he moved. Methodical, practiced, like he had done this many times before. He was not rushing. He was not nervous. He was sorting through my children's Christmas presents like he had all the time in the world, and that calmness was more frightening than anything else. I pressed myself against the wall of the stairwell, trying to become invisible, trying to think. My phone was upstairs on the nightstand. Stephanie was asleep. My kids were asleep. And there was a stranger in my living room with a knife. I took one slow step backward, placing my foot carefully on the stair behind me, when movement at the edge of my vision made me turn my head. There was a second figure on the staircase, maybe 8 steps below me, climbing toward the bedrooms. This one was bigger, broader, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. He had not seen me yet because he was focused on the stairs ahead, moving with that same eerie patience as his partner downstairs. My heart was slamming so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had maybe 2 seconds before he looked up and saw me standing there in the dark. I thought about my daughter sleeping in her room with the door cracked open because she was afraid of the dark. I thought about my son, only 4 years old, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. I thought about Stephanie, completely unaware that 2 strangers had entered our home while we slept. In that moment, I was not brave. I was not a hero. I was a father who realized that everything he loved was in danger, and I had no idea what to do. I did the only thing that made sense. I moved. Not down toward the man by the tree, but up, as fast and as quietly as I could manage. The figure on the stairs was still looking down at his feet, watching his steps, and I used those precious seconds to slip back into the upstairs hallway. My pulse was roaring in my ears so loud I was certain they could hear it. I ducked into the bathroom across from our bedroom and pressed myself behind the door, leaving it open just a crack so I could see the top of the stairs. I needed to think. I needed a plan. The baseball bat I kept in the closet seemed impossibly far away now, in the bedroom where Stephanie was sleeping. If I woke her up, she might make noise. If I went for the bat, the man on the stairs might reach the hallway before I got back. Every option felt like a trap. Through the crack in the bathroom door, I watched the dark shape of the hooded figure reach the top step. He paused there, his head turning slowly as he scanned the hallway, and I held my breath until my lungs burned. He moved toward Harper's room first. Her door was the closest to the stairs, and she always left it open a few inches because of the nightlight in the hallway. I watched him push it open wider with one gloved hand, and something inside me snapped. I stopped thinking about plans and options and what made sense. I stepped out of the bathroom, crossed the hallway in 3 strides, and grabbed the back of his hoodie with both hands before he could step inside my daughter's room. The man was heavier than me, probably had 40 pounds on my frame, but I had momentum and rage and the kind of strength that only comes when your child is 10 feet away from a stranger in the dark. I yanked him backward with everything I had, and we both went down hard on the hallway floor. He let out a grunt of surprise, and somewhere downstairs I heard the other one call out, a sharp, questioning sound that was not quite a word. The man beneath me started thrashing, trying to twist around, and I felt something hard press against my ribs. A flashlight, maybe, or something worse. I did not wait to find out. I drove my elbow into the side of his head, once, twice, and then I was on my feet again, screaming for Stephanie to wake up, to call 911 to get the kids. Everything after that happened in fragments, like my brain could only record pieces at a time. Stephanie's voice, confused and then terrified, asking what was happening. Harper crying out from her room, that high-pitched wail that children make when they wake up scared. The man on the floor groaning, rolling onto his side, and me standing over him with my fists clenched, waiting for him to get up so I could hit him again. I heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, the second intruder, the one with the Santa hat, coming to help his partner. I grabbed the only thing within reach, a heavy ceramic vase that Stephanie's mother had given us as a housewarming gift. and I positioned myself between the staircase and my daughter's door. When the man in the Santa hat appeared at the top of the stairs, I did not hesitate. I swung the vase at his face with both hands, and it connected with a sound I will never forget, a wet, crunching impact that sent him stumbling backward. He caught himself on the railing, blood streaming from his nose, and for one long second we just stared at each other. His eyes were wide and shocked above a black cloth mask that covered the lower half of his face. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, and in that moment he looked almost as scared as I felt. He ran. He turned around and went down those stairs so fast he nearly fell, and I heard the front door slam open as he fled into the night. The man on the hallway floor was trying to crawl toward the stairs now, leaving a smear of blood on the carpet from where my elbow had split something open on his face. Stephanie was in the doorway of our bedroom with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice shaking as she told the 911 operator our address. I could hear Harper sobbing and Miles calling out for Mommy, and I wanted to go to them so badly it hurt, but I could not take my eyes off the man on the floor. He made it to the top of the stairs, pulled himself up using the railing, and half ran, half fell down to the first floor. I followed him to the top step and watched him stumble through the living room, past the scattered presents and torn wrapping paper, and out the same door his partner had used. The whole thing, from the moment I woke up to the moment they were gone, was maybe 4 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like seconds. When I finally let myself breathe, my legs gave out, and I sat down right there on the top stair, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. The police arrived in under 6 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Stephanie had gathered both kids into our bedroom and locked the door, and I stayed at the top of the stairs with that broken vase still clutched in my hand, watching the front door like the men might come back at any moment. When I saw the red and blue lights flashing through the living room windows, I nearly started crying. 2 officers came in with their weapons drawn, clearing each room before they let us come downstairs. Harper would not stop shaking, and Miles kept asking why there was blood on the floor, and I did not have any answers that a 4-year-old could understand. One of the officers, a woman with short gray hair and a calm voice that seemed designed for moments like this, sat with Stephanie and the kids while her partner walked me through the house. That was when we found the window. It was in the small guest bathroom on the first floor, the one we barely used, tucked behind the laundry room. The window was wide open, the screen removed and placed neatly against the wall outside. My brother-in-law had used that bathroom during the party, and when I checked, I realized the lock had never been turned after he left. Such a small thing. Such a stupid, simple oversight. And 2 strangers had slipped through it while my family slept upstairs. The officers told me we were lucky. They said home invasions on Christmas Eve were more common than people think. Criminals know that houses are full of new electronics, jewelry, cash gifts, and families are distracted by celebration. They know that guests come and go, that doors and windows get opened and forgotten, that the noise of a party can cover almost anything. They also told me that most burglars run the moment they realize someone is home. That confrontation is the last thing they want. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had not woken up, if that rustling paper had not pulled me out of sleep. The man with the Santa hat had been sorting through presents to find the most valuable items, probably electronics and gift cards, things that are easy to carry and easy to sell. But his partner had been heading upstairs. The officer did not say what he thought the second man was looking for up there, and I did not ask, because some questions have answers you do not want to hear. They took our statements, photographed the blood on the carpet, and the broken vase and the open window, and told us that detectives would follow up in the morning. By the time they left, it was almost 5 in the morning, and the sky outside was starting to turn gray with the first light of Christmas Day. We did not open presents that morning. Harper asked once in a small voice if Santa had still come, and I had to walk into the kitchen so she would not see my face. Stephanie handled it better than I did. She always does, and somehow convinced the kids that we would do Christmas later, that right now we needed to rest and be together. We spent the morning huddled on our bed, all 4 of us, watching cartoons on Stephanie's laptop while I kept glancing at the bedroom door. I had pushed our dresser in front of it, which was probably ridiculous since the intruders were long gone, but I could not stop myself. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow in the hallway looked like a figure in a hood. The kids eventually fell asleep around noon, exhausted from the disrupted night, and Stephanie and I just sat there holding each other without speaking. I kept replaying every moment in my head, thinking about all the ways it could have gone differently. What if the man on the stairs had been faster? What if he had been armed with something worse than whatever I felt against my ribs? What if I had not woken up at all? The thoughts spiraled and spiraled until Stephanie squeezed my hand and told me to stop, that we were okay, that everyone was safe. She was right, but knowing that did not make the fear go away. They caught them 3 days later. A neighbor 2 streets over had a doorbell camera that recorded the men fleeing down the sidewalk, and the footage was clear enough to show their faces once they pulled off their masks while running to their car. The one I hit with the vase was 23 years old, a guy named Ronald Becker, with a string of prior burglary charges in 3 different states. His partner was his cousin, 19. No prior record, but plenty of connection to stolen goods that police found when they searched their apartment. They had hit 4 other homes that same week, all in neighborhoods where holiday parties made for easy targets. During the investigation, a detective told me something that still keeps me up at night. He said that based on what they found in the cousin's apartment, zip ties, duct tape, a handgun that the younger one had left in their car that night, there was a possibility they had been planning to do more than just steal presents. He could not say for certain what their intentions were, and neither of them confessed to anything beyond burglary. But he wanted me to know that what I did on that staircase, the decision to fight instead of hide, might have prevented something much worse. I think about that every single day. I think about how close we came to a different ending, one where I am not writing this post because I am not here to write it. We moved out of that house 6 months later. Stephanie and I agreed that we could never feel safe there again, and the kids had nightmares for months about bad men coming through the windows. We live in an apartment building now, on the 4th floor, with a security desk in the lobby and cameras in every hallway. I check the locks 3 times before bed. I sleep with a bat next to my nightstand, and every Christmas Eve, while other families are laughing and celebrating, I stay awake until dawn, listening for sounds that do not belong. Volunteering for the Ashford Winter Festival seemed like a good idea, until I realized it meant standing outside for 6 hours in December checking vendor permits. My sister Amanda had convinced me to sign up, insisting I needed to do something other than mope around that apartment. She wasn't wrong. After my divorce finalized in August, I'd spent most evenings staring at my phone and drinking cheap wine, scrolling through photos of my ex-husband's new life like some kind of masochist. Moving back to my hometown had felt like admitting defeat, but the rent above the pharmacy on Main Street was affordable, and I needed a fresh start somewhere familiar. The annual festival brought out everyone in town, all bundled up in their winter coats, wandering between craft booths and food trucks, while Christmas music blared from speakers mounted on every lamppost. By the time I graduated high school back in 2013, I'd already been dreaming of leaving Ashford behind. But here I was at 30, clipboard in hand, making sure the kettle corn guy had the right permits, and the jewelry vendors weren't blocking the sidewalk. Life has a funny way of circling back on you. The festival stretched along Main Street for 4 blocks, with the official bonfire set up at the north end near the community center. I could see the orange glow from where I stood, hear the high school choir singing carols while families gathered around to roast marshmallows. The fire department had 2 guys stationed there in reflective vests, keeping watch to make sure nobody got hurt. Everything ran like clockwork in Ashford, predictable and safe, which was exactly what I'd been craving after the mess of my marriage. Around 8 that evening, the cold started seeping through my jacket, making my fingers ache even inside my gloves. I decided to cut through the alley behind the pharmacy to run upstairs and grab my heavier coat. That's when I noticed the smoke. Thick, dark smoke rising into the night sky from somewhere past the south end of Main Street, near the old Hutchinson barn that had been abandoned since I was a kid. My brain immediately jumped to teenagers starting their own fire, probably trying to drink beer and feel rebellious away from their parents. But something about the smoke bothered me. It was too much, too dark, and coming from the wrong direction entirely. If you were trying to stay hidden from the festival crowds, I should have just grabbed my coat and gone back to my post. I should have assumed it was nothing, maybe some debris burning in a barrel or a controlled burn someone forgot to mention. But curiosity has always been my worst quality, the thing that made me check my ex's phone in the first place and find all those messages that ended my marriage. So instead of being smart, I walked toward the smoke. The alley behind Main Street was mostly empty, just a few people cutting through to get to the parking lot faster. I passed the back entrance to the hardware store and the dumpsters behind the diner, my boots crunching on gravel and bits of ice. The temperature felt even colder away from the crowds, away from the body heat and the lights. As I got closer to the Hutchinson property, the smell hit me first. Not wood smoke like you'd expect from a campfire, but something chemical and sharp that made my throat tighten. The barn sat about 50 yards off Main Street, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had more holes than actual fence at this point. Kids had been sneaking in there for years to drink and fool around, leaving behind beer cans and cigarette butts. I'd done it myself back in high school, making out with Tommy Brennan on a dare while our friends kept watch outside. The smoke was definitely coming from behind the barn, rising in thick plumes that looked almost black against the night sky. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, ducking through one of the gaps in the fence. My heart was pounding now. Not from fear exactly, but from that electric feeling you get when you know you're seeing something you're not supposed to see. The ground was uneven, full of frozen mud and dead weeds that grabbed at my ankles. I could hear the festival in the distance, all those voices singing and laughing, completely unaware that anything was wrong. When I rounded the corner of the barn, I saw the fire. It was bigger than I expected, burning in what looked like an old oil drum someone had dragged out there. The flames licked up into the darkness, casting flickering shadows across the weathered wood of the barn. And then I saw the person, a figure maybe 20 feet away from me, hunched over the drum and tossing something into the flames. They were wearing dark clothes, a heavy jacket with the hood pulled up, and they moved quickly, urgently, like they were racing against time. My breath caught in my chest. I stepped back instinctively, trying to stay in the shadows, but my boot hit a piece of metal and it made a loud clang that echoed across the empty lot. The figure's head snapped up. For a second, neither of us moved. I could see their face partially illuminated by the firelight, but the hood cast too many shadows for me to make out any real features. Then they dropped whatever they'd been holding and ran. Not toward me, thank God, but in the opposite direction, cutting through the far side of the property toward the woods that bordered the edge of town. They moved fast, stumbling once on the rough terrain but recovering quickly, and within seconds they disappeared into the tree line. My legs felt like they'd been filled with cement. Every instinct screamed at me to run back to the festival, to find a cop or a firefighter or literally anyone else to deal with this. But I couldn't stop staring at the oil drum, at the flames still crackling and spitting embers into the air. Whatever that person had been burning, there was still evidence left. I took a few shaky steps forward, holding my phone up to get a better look. The heat from the fire hit my face, making my eyes water. Inside the drum I could see fabric, dark pieces of what looked like clothing curling and blackening in the flames. A jacket sleeve, maybe part of a shirt, something that might have been denim. My stomach turned. This wasn't teenagers burning trash or getting rid of old furniture. This was deliberate, secretive, wrong. I didn't touch anything. Every crime show I'd ever watched screamed at me not to contaminate a scene, assuming this even was a scene, and not just my paranoid brain making connections that didn't exist. But I took photos, lots of them. The oil drum, the flames, the partially burned clothing. the footprints in the mud leading toward the woods. My hands were shaking so badly that half the pictures came out blurry, but I kept snapping anyway, documenting everything I could see. Then I heard voices. Not from the festival, but closer, coming from near the fence. Two men talking in low tones, and one of them laughed at something the other said. Panic seized my chest. I didn't know if they were connected to whoever had been burning things, or if they were just festival goers taking a shortcut, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I turned and walked as quickly as I could back toward the gap in the fence, trying not to run and draw attention to myself. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. When I made it back to the alley behind Main Street, the sounds of the festival washed over me like a wave. Christmas music, children laughing, someone announcing the winners of the gingerbread house contest over a loudspeaker. Everything normal and cheerful and completely oblivious to what I'd just seen 50 yards away. I found Officer Daniels near the hot chocolate stand, talking to someone's grandmother about parking violations. He'd been on the Ashford police force for as long as I could remember, one of those guys who seemed born to wear a uniform and hand out stern warnings to teenagers. When I approached him, my voice came out higher than I intended, breathless and shaky. I told him everything: the smoke, the figure, the burning clothes, the way they'd run into the woods. He listened with his arms crossed, his expression shifting from polite interest to something more serious as I pulled up the photos on my phone. The images looked even worse on the small screen, the flames bright and angry, those charred pieces of fabric clearly visible. Daniels told me to stay put and radioed for backup, his voice calm but clipped in that way cops have when they're trying not to alarm civilians. Within 10 minutes, 2 more officers arrived, and they headed toward the Hutchinson property with flashlights and radios crackling. Daniels asked me to come down to the station after the festival ended to give a formal statement. I nodded, still feeling like my chest was filled with ice water. Amanda found me 20 minutes later asking why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't even begin to explain. The festival wound down around 11, families packing up their kids and heading home to wait for Santa. I drove to the police station in my beat-up sedan, the Christmas lights on Main Street feeling surreal and almost mocking now. The station was a small brick building that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat in a hard plastic chair and gave my statement to Daniels and another officer, a younger woman named Hayes, who took notes on a laptop. They asked me to describe the figure I'd seen in as much detail as possible: height, build, clothing, anything distinctive, but I had almost nothing useful to give them. Average height, maybe. The hood had obscured everything. They moved quickly, but not like an athlete, just someone desperate. Hayes asked if I'd noticed any cars parked nearby, any sounds other than the fire. I hadn't. I'd been too focused on not getting caught myself. When they finished with me, Daniels walked me to the door and told me they'd secured the scene and would investigate thoroughly in the morning. His tone was professional, but I could see something in his eyes, a tightness around his mouth that told me he was taking this seriously. I drove home and didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those flames and that hooded figure disappearing into the darkness. The news broke before I even woke up on Christmas morning, though calling what I did sleeping would be generous. My phone started buzzing around 7 with texts from Amanda, from people I hadn't talked to in months, all asking the same thing. Did you hear about Stephanie Carr? I sat up in bed, my whole body aching from tension, and opened the group chat where half the town seemed to be losing their minds. Stephanie Carr, 41 years old, lived on Oakmont Avenue with her husband and their teenage son. She'd been at the festival the night before, working one of the craft booths selling handmade candles. Her husband reported her missing around 6 in the morning when he woke up and realized she'd never come home. Her car was still parked on Main Street where she'd left it. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Nobody had seen her since around 8 the previous evening, right around the time I'd been standing behind that barn watching someone burn clothes. My mouth went dry. I called Daniels immediately, my fingers fumbling with the phone. He picked up on the second ring and his voice sounded exhausted. He told me they were already looking into possible connections, that I needed to come back to the station as soon as possible. The police station was completely different from the night before. Now it was full of people, officers moving quickly between rooms, phones ringing constantly, someone setting up a command board with photos and timelines. Hayes met me at the entrance and brought me to a small interview room that smelled like stale air and anxiety. Daniels came in a few minutes later with a folder under his arm and dark circles under his eyes that told me he hadn't slept either. He laid out photos on the table between us. Crime scene photos from the Hutchinson property, taken in daylight. The oil drum, now cold and empty except for ash. And there, among the debris, clearly visible in the harsh light of the camera flash, were the remnants of clothing. A burnt piece of fabric with a distinctive pattern, blue and white checks. Daniels pulled out another photo, this one from Stephanie's husband. Showed Stephanie at the festival the night before, smiling at the camera, wearing a blue and white checkered flannel shirt. The same pattern. My vision swam for a second. Daniels asked me to look at the photos I'd taken the night before again, to see if I noticed anything else now that I knew what we were looking for. I scrolled through them slowly, my stomach churning. In one of the shots, partially obscured by smoke, you could see something else in the flames. What looked like the strap of a purse, the corner of a leather bag. Stephanie's booth had been selling candles in handmade bags. The investigation moved fast after that. Daniels brought in state police because Ashford didn't have the resources for something this serious. And suddenly, our tiny town was crawling with detectives and forensic teams. They combed through the Hutchinson property for 2 full days, collecting ash samples and photographing every footprint they could find. The story spread like wildfire. Excuse the expression. Everyone had a theory. Some people thought Stephanie had run off with another man and staged her own disappearance. Others whispered about her husband, about how he'd seemed too calm when he reported her missing. How marriages always look perfect from the outside until they don't. I knew better. I'd seen someone actively destroying evidence. Someone who'd chosen that exact night because they knew the whole town would be distracted by Christmas carols and hot chocolate. The festival had provided perfect cover. Hundreds of people moving around, cars parked everywhere. Everyone focused on anything except what was happening 50 yards away in the darkness. On the 3rd day after Christmas, they found her. A hiker's dog picked up a scent in the woods about 2 miles from the Hutchinson barn, leading them to a shallow grave covered with branches and frozen leaves. Stephanie Carr had been strangled. The medical examiner estimated time of death around 8:30 on the night of the festival, maybe an hour after she was last seen. My photos, as blurry and amateur as they were, became crucial evidence in establishing a timeline. The arrest came 2 weeks later, and it wasn't who anyone expected. Brian Kimball, a 46-year-old contractor who'd done work on half the houses in Ashford, including Stephanie's. Turned out he'd been having an affair with her for 8 months, and when she tried to end it, threatened to tell her husband everything. She'd called it off that night at the festival, told him it was over for good. Security footage from the pharmacy caught him following her when she left her booth, walking toward the back of Main Street. The footprints at the scene matched his work boots. Fibers from his truck were found on her body. He'd killed her in a moment of rage, panicked, and then tried to destroy any evidence that might connect them by burning her belongings during the festival when he thought nobody would notice an extra fire. But he hadn't counted on someone like me. Someone bored and curious enough to investigate smoke coming from the wrong direction. During the trial, the prosecutor used my testimony and my photos extensively. I had to sit on that stand and describe everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt in that moment when I realized I was watching someone cover up a murder. The defense tried to argue that I couldn't identify their client, that the figure could have been anyone. They were right about that part. I never saw his face, but the physical evidence, combined with the timeline my photos established, was enough. Brian Kimball was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. I still live in Ashford, still in that apartment above the pharmacy. The festival happens every year, same decorations, same carolers, Same hot chocolate stand. But I don't volunteer anymore. I can't walk past the Hutchinson property without feeling sick, even though they tore down the barn last spring and turned it into a community garden. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the woman who saw something and actually did something about it, and they treat me like some kind of hero. But I don't feel heroic. I feel like I accidentally stumbled into someone else's nightmare and barely escaped with my sanity intact. Stephanie's son graduated high school last year. I saw the announcement in the local paper, saw his mother's name listed in memoriam. He'll grow up knowing his mom was murdered by someone she trusted, someone who pretended to care about her. That kind of betrayal doesn't just kill the victim, it kills something in everyone who loved them too. My sister still asks me to get out more, to stop isolating myself, but she doesn't understand that some things change you in ways you can't explain. I learned that evil doesn't look like a monster or announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it looks like a contractor in a work jacket, someone your neighbors trust to fix their roof or remodel their kitchen, someone who can smile at you in the hardware store and then strangle a woman to death an hour later because she wouldn't do what he wanted. That's the part that haunts me most. Not what I saw that night, but how ordinary it all was. How easily it could have gone completely unnoticed if I'd just minded my own business and grabbed my coat like I planned. Termine. Carla had been planning our Christmas Eve gathering since early November. She wanted everything perfect for our first holiday season in the new house, a modest 3-bedroom we had closed on back in September, tucked away in a quiet suburb outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Our daughter Sophie had just turned 5, and our son Eli was 7, old enough to remember this Christmas for years to come. My parents made the drive down from Maryland, and Carla's sister Renee came with her husband and their twin toddlers. By 6 in the evening, the house was alive with warmth and noise, the smell of cinnamon candles mixing with roasted ham, string lights glowing along the staircase banister. A playlist of old Christmas classics hummed softly through the Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen. Watching everyone gathered in our living room, I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. At 33, after years of renting cramped apartments and saving every spare dollar, I had finally built something real for my family. Our next-door neighbor was a man named Glenn Partridge. He lived alone in a tan brick house with overgrown hedges and a permanent collection of Amazon boxes stacked by his front door. I had spoken to him maybe 4 times since we moved in, and each conversation left me feeling slightly unsettled without being able to pinpoint exactly why. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and deep-set eyes that always seemed to be looking past you rather than at you. He never smiled, never waved from his driveway, and once, when Sophie's soccer ball rolled onto his lawn, he stood at his window watching us retrieve it for a full minute before slowly pulling the blinds shut. Carla told me I was being paranoid, that some people were just private. I wanted to believe her. That Christmas Eve, around 7 in the evening, I noticed Glenn standing at the edge of his property, staring at our house as guests arrived. He was wearing a brown jacket despite the cold, and he just stood there, motionless, watching car after car pull into our driveway. I tried to push Glenn out of my mind as the evening went on. The kids were running between the living room and the hallway, chasing each other with foam swords Eli had gotten as an early gift. My father was telling his old army stories to Renee's husband, who nodded politely while nursing a glass of bourbon. Carla and her sister were in the kitchen, laughing about something from their childhood, and my mother was rocking one of the twins in the corner armchair. The volume inside the house was never excessive, just the natural hum of a family enjoying themselves. We kept the music low enough that we could talk without shouting. By 9 o'clock, the kids were getting tired, and we started winding things down. Sophie fell asleep on the couch, and Eli was fighting to keep his eyes open while watching a Christmas movie on the television. I stepped outside briefly to grab more firewood from the pile beside the garage, and that was when I saw Glenn again. He was standing on his front porch now, arms crossed, staring directly at me. I raised my hand in an awkward wave, but he did not respond. He just kept staring. Around 10, I got a notification on my phone from our front door camera. We had installed a Ring doorbell a few weeks after moving in, mostly because Carla wanted to see package deliveries. I opened the app and felt my chest tighten. The camera showed Glenn pacing back and forth on the sidewalk in front of our house, maybe 15 feet from our property line. His movements were erratic, jerky, like he was arguing with someone who was not there. I could see his lips moving rapidly, but the audio was hard to make out over the ambient noise. I turned up the volume on my phone and pressed it against my ear, trying to catch what he was saying. His voice came through in fragments, distorted but unmistakable. He kept repeating something about people disrespecting him, about how nobody takes him seriously, about how he was done being ignored. And then, as he turned slightly toward the streetlight, I saw it clearly. There was a handgun tucked into the waistband of his jeans, the black metal glinting under the pale yellow glow. I showed the video to Carla in the kitchen, keeping my voice low so the others would not hear. Her face went pale as she watched Glenn pace and mutter, and when I pointed out the gun, she grabbed my arm hard enough to leave a mark. We debated calling the police right then, but part of me hesitated. Glenn had not actually done anything illegal yet. He was on a public sidewalk, and North Carolina is an open carry state. I kept telling myself that maybe he was just having a bad night. Maybe he would go back inside and sleep it off. But then another notification came through, and when I checked the camera again, Glenn was standing completely still now, facing our front door. His hands were at his sides, and he was no longer talking to himself. He was just staring at the house with an intensity that made my mouth go dry. My father noticed something was wrong and came over, asking if everything was all right. I did not know how to explain it, so I just handed him my phone and let him watch for himself. His expression hardened immediately. He had seen combat in Vietnam, and I think he recognized danger in a way that I, in my comfortable suburban life, had never learned to. My father told me to stay inside and keep everyone calm while he went to talk to Glenn. I tried to stop him, tried to tell him about the gun, but he waved me off with the confidence of a man who had faced worse. I watched through the living room window as my father walked down the driveway, his posture relaxed but deliberate. Glenn saw him coming and did not move. They stood about 10 feet apart, and I could see my father talking, his hands open and visible in a gesture of peace. For a moment, I thought it might actually work. Glenn seemed to be listening, his head tilted slightly to one side. Then, without any warning at all, everything changed. Glenn reached down to his waistband and pulled out the handgun, holding it at his side but not quite pointing it at my father. He said something I could not hear from inside the house, but I saw my father's body stiffen. I was already moving toward the front door when Glenn raised his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. He was screaming now, demanding that we end the party immediately, saying the noise was a direct attack on him, that we had been plotting against him for months. I yanked the front door open and stepped onto the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs. Glenn swung his attention toward me, and for the first time I saw his eyes up close in the dim light. They were wide, almost feverish, and there was a disconnect in them that I had never noticed before. It was like he was looking at me, but also looking at something else entirely, something that existed only in his mind. My father had not moved, had not flinched, and I tried to match his composure even though every instinct in my body was telling me to run. Glenn pointed at me with his free hand, the gun still gripped tightly in the other. He said I knew what I had done, that everyone on the street knew, that we had been sending him signals through the noise, through the cars, through the lights. He said he had documented everything, that he had recordings, that the police were in on it too, but he was going to prove it all. His words tumbled out in a rapid, disjointed stream, jumping from accusation to accusation without any coherent thread. I realized then that Glenn was not just angry. There was something deeply broken inside him. Carla had already called 911 from inside the house. I could hear her voice through the open door, high and strained, giving our address and describing the situation. My father slowly raised both hands, palms out, and took a small step backward. He spoke to Glenn in a low, steady voice, telling him that we did not want any trouble, that we were just having a family dinner, that nobody was plotting anything. Glenn shook his head violently, his lips curling back in a grimace. He said that was exactly what we would say, that we had rehearsed it, that he was not stupid. The gun in his hand twitched, and I felt my legs turn to rubber. My children were inside that house. My mother, Carla, everyone I loved was just a few feet away, separated from this man by nothing but a wooden door and a few walls. I thought about what a bullet could do, how easily it could tear through drywall and insulation, how quickly everything could end. The Christmas lights on our staircase suddenly seemed absurd, mocking, a reminder of how naive I had been to think this night would be perfect. The sirens came before Glenn could make his next move. I heard them in the distance first, a faint wail that grew louder with each passing second. Glenn heard them too, and something shifted in his expression. The feverish intensity in his eyes flickered, replaced by a flash of confusion, and then something that almost looked like fear. He glanced toward the end of the street, then back at us, then at the gun in his hand as if he had forgotten he was holding it. My father used that moment of hesitation to take another step back, putting more distance between himself and Glenn. I stayed perfectly still on the porch, afraid that any sudden movement might snap Glenn back into whatever dark place his mind had been occupying. The police cruiser appeared at the corner, its red and blue lights painting the houses in alternating colors. A second cruiser followed close behind. Glenn lowered the gun to his side but did not drop it, and I could see his jaw working, his teeth grinding together as he processed what was happening. Part of me expected him to run, or worse, to start shooting. Instead, he just stood there, frozen, like a man waking up from a nightmare and realizing he was still inside it. The officers approached with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Glenn dropped the gun onto the sidewalk, and for a moment he looked almost relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They cuffed him quickly and efficiently, and as they led him toward the cruiser, he turned his head and looked directly at me. There was no anger in his expression anymore, no accusation, just a hollow emptiness that made me feel something I did not expect to feel in that moment. Pity. One of the officers came to speak with us while his partner secured Glenn in the back seat. He was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, with a calm demeanor that suggested he had handled situations like this before. He asked if anyone was hurt, if we had the doorbell footage, if we wanted to press charges. I told him we had everything recorded and that we absolutely wanted to pursue this as far as the law would allow. He nodded and said something that stuck with me long after that night. He said Glenn had called 911 3 times that month, accusing various neighbors of plotting against him, monitoring his movements, sending coded messages through their landscaping choices. The department had flagged him as a person of concern, but without an overt threat, their hands had been tied. We went back inside after the police left, and I remember the strange silence that had settled over the house. The Christmas music was still playing softly from the kitchen speaker, but nobody was listening anymore. My mother was holding Sophie in her arms, the little girl still half asleep and unaware of what had just happened outside. Eli was sitting on the couch with wide eyes, and I knew he had seen more than I wanted him to. Renee's husband was pouring himself another bourbon with hands that were not quite steady, and Carla was standing by the window, staring at the empty spot on the sidewalk where Glenn had been standing just minutes before. Nobody knew what to say. The ham was getting cold on the counter, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers. I walked over to Carla and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me without saying a word. My father came inside last, closing the door behind him and locking the deadbolt with a heavy click. He looked at me and gave a small nod, the kind of silent acknowledgement that passed between men who had just survived something together. Glenn was charged with aggravated assault and menacing, and he was held without bail pending a psychiatric evaluation. We learned later that he had been diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia years ago, but had stopped taking his medication sometime in the fall. His family, what little he had left, lived out of state and had lost contact with him after he pushed them away with accusations similar to the ones he had thrown at us. The house next door sat empty for months after that night, its overgrown hedges growing even wilder, its Amazon boxes eventually cleared away by a property management company. We put up a fence the following spring, a tall wooden barrier that blocked our view of his property entirely. It was not really about security anymore. It was about not having to look at that tan brick house every time I stepped outside. Sophie and Eli do not remember much about that Christmas Eve, and I am grateful for that. But sometimes when I check the Ring camera at night before going to bed, I still feel a flicker of that old fear. I scroll through the footage quickly, just to make sure there is no one standing on the sidewalk, staring at our door. So far, there never is. But I check anyway, every single night, because I learned something that Christmas about how quickly the world can turn dangerous, and I am never going to forget it. My daughter Molly had begged me to leave the Christmas lights on overnight. She was spending Christmas Eve at her father's place this year, part of the custody arrangement we had worked out after the divorce. But she made me promise on the phone that I would keep the tree glowing until morning. "It looks magical from outside, Mom," she had said, and even though she would not be there to see it, I left them on anyway. I had moved into this small craftsman home in Tacoma, Washington, 8 months earlier, right after everything was finalized. The house had a stone fireplace that the realtor described as a rare find, and I had filled the mantel with stockings and garland because decorating for one felt less pathetic if I really committed to it. That Christmas morning, I woke before my alarm, somewhere around 5, to a sound I could not immediately place. It was a scraping noise, rhythmic and metallic, coming from somewhere on the first floor. I lay there in the darkness of my bedroom, holding my breath, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The sound came again, and this time there was no mistaking it. My neighbor Gwen had been complaining about raccoons for weeks. They had gotten into her attic and caused all sorts of damage before animal control finally dealt with them. I assumed one had found its way into my chimney, maybe attracted by the residual warmth from the fire I'd let die out the night before. I grabbed my robe from the hook on the back of the door and slipped on my worn house slippers, not bothering with lights as I padded down the narrow hallway toward the living room. The Christmas tree cast soft colored shadows across the walls, and beneath it sat the pile of wrapped presents I had prepared for Molly's visit later that afternoon. My laptop was on the coffee table, along with the small jewelry box my mother had given me years ago. I had been sorting through old pieces the night before, trying to decide what to pass down to Molly when she got older. The scraping grew louder as I approached the fireplace, a grinding metallic sound that seemed to echo inside the flue. I knelt down on the cold hearth, leaning forward to peer up into the darkness, expecting to see the panicked eyes of a trapped animal staring back at me. What I saw instead was a black boot, a single black boot, scuffed and dirty, dangling about 2 feet above the iron grate. It was attached to a leg wrapped in red fabric, cheap shiny polyester that caught the faint glow from the Christmas tree lights. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process what I was looking at. I remember thinking, in this absurd flash of confusion, that maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe I had not actually gotten out of bed, and this was one of those hyper-realistic nightmares that feel so vivid you can smell things. But I could smell something. Cigarette smoke, stale and clinging to whatever was coming down my chimney. The boot shifted and I heard a grunt from somewhere above it, a distinctly human sound of effort. A man was inside my chimney. A man dressed in what looked like a Santa Claus costume was trying to lower himself into my living room at 5 in the morning on Christmas Day. I scrambled backwards so fast that I knocked into the coffee table, sending my mother's jewelry box clattering to the floor. The noise must have startled him because the movement stopped. I could hear breathing now, heavy, labored breathing echoing down the flue. I was on my hands and knees on the living room floor, staring at that single boot suspended in the darkness of my fireplace, and I could not make myself move. My phone was upstairs on my nightstand. The landline I never used was in the kitchen. Every logical thought seemed to crash into a wall of pure, paralyzing disbelief. Then the boot moved again, dropping another few inches, and I saw more of the leg emerge. The red velvet pants with white fur trim at the cuff, the kind you see on those cheap Santa costumes at party stores. A second boot appeared beside the first one. He was coming down. He was actually coming down into my house, and I was just kneeling there on my floor watching it happen like I had lost the ability to function. Something in me finally snapped into gear. Some primal survival instinct that had been dormant my entire comfortable suburban life. And I pushed myself up off the ground and ran for the kitchen. I grabbed the largest knife from the block on the counter, a chef's knife I had gotten as a wedding gift years ago, and barely used for anything more dangerous than chopping onions. The landline phone was mounted on the wall beside the refrigerator, one of those old cordless models that came with the house. I snatched it from the cradle and dialed 911 with fingers that felt numb and clumsy, pressing myself into the corner between the counter and the wall where I could see the doorway to the living room. The operator answered on the second ring, and I remember my voice coming out in this strange whisper, like my body was afraid to make noise even though the rational part of my brain knew I should be screaming. "Someone is breaking into my house," I said. "He's coming down my chimney. He's dressed like Santa Claus." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost feel the operator trying to decide if this was a prank call. I gave her my address, repeated it twice, and told her to please send someone immediately. She said units were being dispatched and asked me to stay on the line. From where I stood in the kitchen, I could not see the fireplace directly, but I could see the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting off the hallway walls. I heard a thud, the sound of someone landing on the iron grate, followed by a grunt and the scraping of boots on metal. He was inside. A stranger in a Santa costume was now standing in my living room, 5 in the morning, while I hid in my kitchen holding a knife and a phone. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the hardwood floor. Then the sound of rustling, like someone picking through the presents under the tree. The operator was saying something in my ear, asking if I was still there, asking if I could see the intruder, but I could barely process her words. I was focused entirely on those sounds, the footsteps, the rustling, the occasional clink of something being moved. He was going through my things. He was standing in the room where my daughter would open her gifts in a few hours, touching her presents with his hands, and I was hiding in the kitchen like a terrified child. Part of me wanted to charge in there with the knife, but a larger part understood that confronting him could get me killed. The footsteps stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was complete silence. I pressed myself harder against the wall, gripping the knife so tight that the handle dug into my palm. Then I heard him move again, and this time the footsteps were coming toward the kitchen. I could see his shadow stretching across the hallway floor before I saw him. This distorted silhouette with the unmistakable outline of a Santa hat. He appeared in the doorway, and for the first time I got a clear look at him. He was maybe 50 years old, with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. The Santa suit hung loose on his thin frame, the white trim yellowed and matted. The red fabric faded to something closer to rust. He had a pillowcase in one hand, already bulging with whatever he had grabbed from my living room. He saw me in the same instant I saw him, and we both went still. His eyes dropped to the knife in my hand, then back up to my face. He did not look surprised or afraid. He looked annoyed, like I was an inconvenience he had not planned for. "Put that down," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored, with a slight rasp that matched the cigarette smell I had noticed earlier. "I'm just here for the stuff. Stay out of my way and nothing happens to you." I did not put the knife down. I could not have even if I wanted to. My fingers seemed locked around the handle. The 911 operator was still on the line, and I prayed she could hear everything, that the police were already close. He took a step into the kitchen, and I raised the knife higher, my arm trembling visibly. "I already called the cops," I managed to say, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, higher and thinner than normal. He paused, tilting his head slightly like he was listening for sirens. In that silence, I heard it too, the distant wail of a police siren cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. His expression shifted then, the annoyance giving way to something colder, more calculating. He glanced toward the back door, then at me, then at the door again, clearly weighing his options. He moved fast. 1 second he was standing in the doorway calculating, and the next he had crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and was yanking open my back door. The cold December air rushed in, carrying the smell of frost and pine. I stayed exactly where I was, still holding that knife, still pressed against the wall, as he disappeared into my backyard. I heard his boots crunching through the thin layer of snow that had fallen the night before, heard the wooden fence groan as he climbed over it, and then nothing. Just the sirens getting closer and the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the kitchen. The operator was asking if I was okay, if he was gone, if I was injured. I told her he had run out the back, gave her a description: older white male, thin build, Santa costume, heading east through the neighbor's yard. My legs gave out somewhere in the middle of that sentence, and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold tile floor, the knife still clutched in my hand like some kind of lifeline. The police arrived maybe 2 minutes later, though it felt like an hour. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of my house, their lights painting the snow red and blue. I managed to get up and unlock the front door for them, and then everything became a blur of uniforms and questions and flashlight beams sweeping through my home. They found the pillowcase he had dropped in the backyard. Inside were my laptop, my mother's jewelry box, 2 of the wrapped presents from under the tree, and a silver picture frame that had been sitting on my mantel. One of the officers, a woman named Ruiz with kind eyes and a calm voice, sat with me at the kitchen table while her partner checked the rest of the house. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning, and I did, though my account came out fragmented and scattered. The chimney, I kept saying. He came down the chimney like it was nothing. She nodded and wrote in her notepad, her expression professionally neutral, but I could see something in her eyes that told me this was not the first time she had heard something like this. They caught him 4 blocks away, still wearing the Santa suit. Officer Ruiz came back later that morning to tell me, after the sun had come up and my house no longer felt like a crime scene. His name was Vincent Holt, 52 years old, with a record that included multiple burglary convictions dating back to the late 90s. What she told me next made me feel sick in a way I had not expected. He had been doing this for at least 3 weeks, entering homes through chimneys on Christmas morning, dressed in that ridiculous costume as a form of camouflage. If any neighbor happened to glance out their window at dawn and saw a figure in red and white on a rooftop, they would assume it was a decoration, or maybe dismiss it as their eyes playing tricks in the early light. He had specifically targeted homes where he had observed single women living alone, watching houses for days beforehand to learn routines and identify easy marks. Ruiz said they had connected him to at least 4 other break-ins across the Tacoma area, though they suspected there were more victims who had not reported anything because they had slept through the whole thing. I was the first one who had been awake, the first one who had seen him coming down. Molly came over that afternoon and I did not tell her what had happened. I cleaned up the soot he had tracked across the floor, put the presents back under the tree, and watched her tear into the wrapping paper with the kind of joy only a child can have on Christmas morning. My ex-husband picked up on something when he dropped her off. He asked if I was feeling okay, said I looked pale, but I just told him I had not slept well. It took me 3 days to stop flinching at every small noise in the house. I had a locksmith come out and install a chimney cap with a heavy-duty lock, the kind that bolts directly into the masonry. I also bought a security system, the type with cameras and sensors on every door and window, and I have not slept through a full night since that morning. Sometimes I still think about his face in the kitchen doorway, that look of mild annoyance, like I was just an obstacle between him and what he wanted. I think about how easily he said, "Nothing happens to you," while his eyes told a completely different story. And every Christmas Eve now, no matter how cold it gets outside, I leave my fireplace damper sealed shut and double-check the locks before I go to bed. Molly still asks me to leave the tree lights on overnight, and I still do it for her. But I sit in the living room until dawn, watching the glow reflect off the walls, listening for sounds that do not belong. Anyone who lives in a small town knows that certain rhythms become part of your life, whether you want them to or not. When I moved to Barrington Falls 5 years after my divorce finalized, I thought the predictability would drive me insane within a month. Instead, I found myself noticing things, small things, like how old Beverly Hutchins across the street always had her Christmas lights programmed to shut off at exactly midnight, every single night from Thanksgiving through New Year's. She was meticulous about it in a way that seemed almost obsessive, but that was Beverly. Retired school teacher, widow for 12 years, the kind of woman who still wore pantyhose to the grocery store and kept her lawn edged like she was expecting a magazine photographer. We weren't close, but we were neighborly. She'd wave from her porch when I got home from the warehouse around 6. I'd help carry her groceries when I saw her struggling with bags. That's how it works in places like this. Christmas Eve 2024 was unseasonably warm for Massachusetts. One of those weird winter nights where you could almost smell the ground thawing. I'd spent the evening at my sister's place in the next town over, eating too much ham and making awkward small talk with her husband's family. Got home around 11:30, tired and ready to collapse. I remember parking in my driveway and seeing Beverly's house across the street, absolutely covered in those old-fashioned multicolored bulbs. She had them strung along every eave, wrapped around the porch columns outlining her windows. It looked like something from a 1950s postcard. The lights were still on, but that made sense since midnight hadn't hit yet. I went inside, brushed my teeth, and fell into bed with my phone scrolling through nothing important. At some point I must have dozed off because when I jerked awake, my neck was stiff and my phone had slipped onto the floor. I reached for it and checked the time. 3:14 in the morning. The house was dark except for the streetlight filtering through my bedroom curtains, and that's when I noticed something that made me sit up fully. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see Beverly's house. Every single Christmas light was still blazing. At first I thought maybe she'd fallen asleep and forgotten to set the timer, but Beverly didn't forget things like that. She was the type who had backups for her backups. I laid there for maybe 10 minutes trying to convince myself it was nothing, that she'd probably just decided to leave them on for Christmas morning or something. But the longer I stared at those lights twinkling through my window, the more wrong it felt. Not supernatural wrong, just wrong in that gut-level way when you know something's off with a person's routine. I finally got up, pulled on jeans and the same sweater I'd worn earlier, and walked outside. The street was completely dead. No cars, no sounds except for a dog barking somewhere 3 blocks over. When I crossed the street and got closer to Beverly's house, that's when I heard it. Music. Christmas music, but cranked up so loud it was spilling out into the yard. Some choir singing about silent nights, except there was nothing silent about it. The volume was almost aggressive, like someone had turned every dial to maximum and walked away. I stood on her walkway for a second, trying to figure out what to do. The porch light was on, same as always, and through the big front window I could see her living room. The Christmas tree in the corner was lit up, those old bubble lights she probably bought in the 70s. Everything looked normal except for the music. I walked up the 3 steps to her porch, and that's when I saw it. The front door wasn't closed all the way. It was open maybe 2 inches, just enough that the jam wasn't catching, and when I got close I could feel warm air leaking out into the night. My first thought was that she'd been robbed, that someone had broken in and hurt her. My second thought was that I should call the cops and not go inside, but you know how it is when you're standing there in the moment. I called out her name instead. Beverly? Miss Hutchins? Nothing except that choir blasting away about peace on earth. I pushed the door open a little wider, enough to stick my head in, and called again. The house smelled like pine needles and something else, something sweet. Cinnamon maybe, or nutmeg. The hallway was empty, the music coming from somewhere deeper inside. I stepped all the way in, leaving the door open behind me in case I needed to run. The music was coming from the kitchen, I could tell now. One of those old CD players, probably, stuck on repeat. I moved through the hallway slowly, past the stairs and the living room entrance, and when I turned the corner into the kitchen, I stopped dead. The table was set for breakfast. Not just set, but arranged like she was expecting company. 2 plates, 2 coffee mugs, 2 cloth napkins folded into triangles. There was a plate of cinnamon rolls in the center, the kind from the bakery on Lexington Avenue, still in their cardboard container. One of the mugs had coffee in it, and when I touched the ceramic, it was barely warm, like someone had poured it maybe 30 minutes ago and then just left. The other mug was empty and clean. On the counter, the coffee maker was still on, the pot half full, the burner light glowing red. I turned it off without thinking, some automatic response to seeing something left running. That's when I noticed the CD player on top of the refrigerator, one of those old boombox things from the 90s. The same 3 songs were cycling over and over, and the volume knob was turned all the way to the right. I reached up and turned it off, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the clock on the wall ticking, my own breathing. I called out again, louder this time. "Beverly, are you here? It's me from across the street." My voice sounded strange in the quiet house, too loud and too thin at the same time. I walked through the downstairs, checking the living room, the dining room, the little bathroom under the stairs. Nothing. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows. Everything was neat and in its place, except Beverly was gone and her door had been open, and her coffee was getting cold on the kitchen table. I went upstairs, my heart hammering now, half expecting to find her collapsed in the bathroom or worse. But the bedroom was empty. The bed made with military precision. The bathroom was spotless. I even checked the closets, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. By the time I got back downstairs, I knew I needed to call someone. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. And when the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain the situation without sounding insane. My neighbor's door is open and she's not home and something feels really wrong. The woman on the other end was calm, asking me questions in that practiced way they do. Had I been inside? Yes. Had I seen any signs of forced entry? No. Was the neighbor elderly? Yes, 79. Could she have gone to stay with family? Maybe. But her car was still in the driveway. I checked through the kitchen window that looked out to the detached garage, and her old Buick was sitting right there behind the glass door. The dispatcher told me to wait outside and that officers were on their way. I went back out to the porch and stood there under those blazing Christmas lights, watching the empty street and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That breakfast table kept replaying in my mind. 2 plates. Why 2 plates? The police showed up maybe 15 minutes later. 2 cruisers rolling down the street with their lights off so they wouldn't wake the whole neighborhood. 4 officers total, and I recognized one of them from the hardware store. A guy named Jeff something who always bought the same brand of work gloves. I explained everything again while they walked through the house with flashlights, even though all the lights were on. They were in there for maybe 20 minutes, and when they came out, the older one, a sergeant with gray hair and a thick mustache, asked me when I'd last seen Beverly. I told him yesterday afternoon, around 4, when she was bringing in groceries. He wrote that down in a little notebook. Then he asked if I knew anything about her having visitors lately, or if she'd mentioned going anywhere. I said no, that we didn't talk much beyond hello and small talk about the weather. That's when the younger officer, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, mentioned something that made my chest tighten. She said a couple of neighbors had reported seeing Beverly arguing with someone in her driveway 2 days ago, on December 23rd. A man. They didn't know who. The sergeant asked me to stick around in case they had more questions, so I sat on my porch across the street while they made calls and took photos, and did whatever else police do at a potential crime scene. More cars showed up as the sun started rising, unmarked ones this time. Detectives, I assumed. By 7 in the morning, half the street was awake and standing in their yards in bathrobes trying to figure out what was happening. I saw Janet Carmichael from 3 houses down talking to one of the officers, pointing at Beverly's house and gesturing with her hands. The officer was writing everything down. Around 8, one of the detectives, a tired-looking guy in his 50s wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, came over and asked if he could talk to me inside my house. We sat at my kitchen table and he introduced himself as Detective Marsh. He asked the same questions the first officers had, but more detailed this time. Did Beverly have family? I didn't know. Did she seem depressed or confused lately? Not that I noticed. Had I ever seen anyone visiting her regularly? Just the lawn guy in summer and someone who looked like a nephew maybe once or twice. Then Marsh asked me about the man in the driveway. I told him I hadn't seen anything, that I worked until 6 most days and must have missed it. He nodded and flipped through his notebook, and that's when he told me something that made everything click into a horrible kind of sense. The man Beverly had been arguing with was identified by 3 separate neighbors. His name was Colin Pritchard, and he was basically Barrington Falls royalty. Owned the largest construction company in the county, donated to every charity event, coached Little League for 15 years, the kind of guy who everyone called a pillar of the community. He and Beverly had some kind of dispute over a property line issue going back 6 months. His company was building a new subdivision on the land behind Beverly's house, and she'd been fighting the zoning permits, claiming the construction was encroaching on her lot and destroying the old oak trees she'd planted with her husband decades ago. Marsh said the argument 2 days ago had gotten heated enough that someone almost called the cops, but Beverly had waved them off and gone back inside. Pritchard had driven away angry, according to witnesses. I sat there processing this while Marsh watched me carefully. He asked if I'd ever had any interactions with Pritchard, and I said no, that I'd seen him around town but never spoke to him. Marsh thanked me and left, and I spent the rest of Christmas Day watching police cars come and go from my window. They brought in search dogs around noon. I watched them work through Beverly's yard and the wooded area behind her property, their handlers walking them in careful grids. The dogs hit on something near the tree line, and suddenly there were more officers back there, marking off areas with yellow tape. My phone rang around 3 in the afternoon. It was my sister asking if I was okay, saying she'd seen something on Facebook about a missing woman in Barrington Falls. I told her I was fine, and that I'd call her later. I couldn't stop thinking about those 2 plates on the table. Had Beverly been expecting Pritchard? Had he come back on Christmas Eve to talk things through, and something had gone wrong? The truth came out piece by piece over the next week, and it was worse than I'd imagined, but also exactly what you'd expect from a small town covering for one of their own until they couldn't anymore. The dogs had found Beverly's scarf in the woods, along with disturbed soil that led cadaver dogs to a shallow grave 30 yards into the tree line behind her property. They found her body on December 27th. The medical examiner determined she'd been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, likely in her own driveway before being dragged into the woods. Pritchard's story fell apart within 48 hours. Security footage from a neighbor's Ring camera showed his truck parked on the street at 11:30 on Christmas Eve. Phone records showed Beverly had called him that evening, probably trying one last time to resolve the property dispute before the holidays. Witnesses came forward saying they'd heard him at the bar on December 23rd, drunk and ranting about that old woman ruining everything and how he'd take care of it himself. He was arrested on December 29th at his office, surrounded by photos of him shaking hands with the mayor and cutting ribbons at charity events. The prosecutor said he'd likely panicked during another argument, hit her with something, maybe a piece of construction equipment from his truck, and then spent hours trying to cover it up. The breakfast table, they figured, was Beverly's attempt at peace. She'd probably invited him over Christmas morning to talk civilly, not knowing he'd already decided violence was easier than compromise. The trial happened in the fall of 2025, and I didn't go. I read about it in the paper like everyone else. Pritchard's defense tried to paint it as an accident, a tragic misunderstanding between neighbors that got out of hand. The jury didn't buy it. He got 25 years to life, and the judge made a point of saying that no amount of money or community standing puts someone above the law. The local paper ran editorials about how Barrington Falls needed to take a hard look at who it chose to trust and elevate. But you know how these things go. 6 months later, people were already talking about Pritchard's son taking over the construction company and how the family had been through enough. Someone started a fundraiser for his legal appeals. That's small towns for you. Forgiveness comes easier for some than others, especially when they've got the right last name and enough people who owe them favors. I still live across the street from Beverly's house. Her nephew sold it in the spring, and a young couple with 2 kids moved in by summer. They repainted it gray and took down all the old Christmas decorations, replaced them with those white icicle lights that look cold and modern. I haven't told them what happened there. They seem happy, and maybe that's enough. But every Christmas when I see lights on houses in the neighborhood, I think about Beverly and those multicolored bulbs blazing at 3 in the morning and that music looping endlessly in her empty kitchen. I think about how she'd spent all that time trying to save those oak trees her husband planted, trying to protect something that mattered to her, and how someone decided his convenience was worth more than her life. The property dispute got resolved after she died, of course. The construction company got their permits, the subdivision went up, and the oak trees came down. Drive past there now and you'd never know they existed. That's the part that gets me the most. She died over trees that don't even cast shadows anymore, killed by a man everyone thought was a good guy, right up until the moment they couldn't pretend anymore. I don't wave at neighbors as much as I used to. I keep my head down and my door locked, and I pay attention when someone's routine changes. Because that's the thing about small towns where everyone knows everyone. Sometimes the monsters are the ones cutting ribbons at charity events and coaching your kids, and nobody wants to see it until it's too late. Christmas morning carried that heavy, padded quiet you only get after a full night of snowfall, and my grandpa Leonard said it was the perfect time to check the back section of the property. At the time, I was 16, and trying hard to pretend I knew what I was doing with a rifle slung over my shoulder, even though he insisted I keep the safety on the whole way. Our family owned a stretch of forested land behind the old cabin, a place we mainly used for hunting and cutting firewood, and it always felt isolated in a peaceful, predictable way. That day, the cold had a strange density to it, the kind that clung to every breath and made even normal sounds feel distant. Leonard walked ahead with his slow, steady steps, humming some off-key Christmas hymn the same way he had since I was little. It was supposed to be just another simple walk, maybe an hour or 2 in the woods before heading back for lunch. Nothing about that morning gave me any hint that someone else had been on our land for a long time, close enough to watch us without being noticed. Snow dampened every footstep as we moved farther from the cabin, following an old, thin trail that only Leonard seemed able to recognize anymore. He kept pointing out fresh deer tracks, telling me to pay attention to how they curved and how the snow dipped beneath them, as if he were giving a lesson I'd remember for the rest of my life. I remember nodding along while trying to ignore the uncomfortable tug of wind sneaking through the seams of my jacket. About half a mile in, the trees thickened into a cluster of spruces so tall they felt like a wall, and Leonard slowed down. Something about the shape of the ground didn't match what he expected. A narrow indentation cut through the snow, not deep like an animal path, but straight and deliberate, with edges softened by fresh flakes. He crouched down and brushed the top layer aside, revealing compacted snow flattened by something heavier than a deer. I noticed a faint sour smell carried by the air, like damp fabric mixed with old smoke. Leonard didn't say anything at first, but the way he squinted told me he didn't like what he was seeing. We followed the strange path deeper into the spruces, moving slower now, the forest closing around us so tightly the sky disappeared above the branches. The trail widened, revealing footprints that had partially refrozen, uneven but unmistakably human, one set, leading farther in. A few yards ahead, something dark poked out behind a cluster of fallen branches. Leonard raised his hand for me to stop, then approached it carefully, using the tip of his boot to brush away loose twigs. What appeared beneath didn't look like anything I'd ever expect to find on our land. A curved sheet of tin, shaped into a half-shelter and buried under packed snow. Its sides were reinforced with logs and pieces of old fencing, all crudely tied together with knotted rope. Inside, through a narrow opening, I could see blankets piled high, a rusty kettle, and a blackened lantern hanging from a nail. The air creeping out from the gap was shockingly warm, carrying the smell of cooked meat and something earthy, almost metallic. It didn't register right away that this wasn't abandoned. Everything looked recently used, almost tended to. Before either of us could make sense of it, a crunch echoed from behind the shelter, like someone stepping on a thick layer of ice. Leonard's entire posture changed. He straightened slowly, eyes darting along the tree line as if he already knew what was coming. A shadow shifted between the spruces about 30 yards away, tall and rigid, too deliberate to be wildlife. I caught only a fraction of the figure, a dark coat, a hood lined with frost, and the briefest glint of something reflective near the person's hand. Whoever it was had been there long enough to realize we'd uncovered the hide. Leonard didn't raise his voice or panic. Instead, he leaned toward me and whispered, barely audible, telling me we needed to walk back the way we came without running. My chest tightened as I caught another glimpse of movement, this time closer, edging around the trees with slow, calculated steps. The person wasn't yelling or threatening us. They were just watching, following the line of the shelter as if gauging how much we'd seen. Leonard tapped my arm lightly, guiding me backward, and the weight of the forest suddenly felt different, thicker, like the woods themselves had started paying attention. Leonard kept his voice low as we moved, telling me to keep my eyes forward and not look back, even though every instinct in me wanted to pinpoint exactly where the stranger was. The forest seemed to absorb the small sounds we made, almost muting them, but every few steps I caught the faint crack of branches behind us, measured, patient, like the stranger wasn't trying to hide anymore. Leonard's hand hovered near my shoulder, steady but tense, guiding me along the narrow path we'd taken earlier. The cold seeped deeper into the air, mixing with the heavy scent that drifted from the hide, something like wet canvas and stale smoke. I kept imagining that whoever lived out here had watched us for weeks, maybe months, studying our routines from this hidden shelter. When we reached a bend where the trees thinned for a moment, Leonard subtly angled his head toward me as if to say, "Almost there." But the look in his eyes said he didn't believe it. A few minutes later, the path dipped downhill, and the snow grew uneven, dotted with chunks of ice that hadn't been there on our way in. Leonard slowed down again, scanning the tree line with quick, darting glances. The stranger was still out of view, but the woods carried a new kind of quiet. Sharp, expectant. I heard a sound off to our right, low and dragging, like something being pulled through the snow. Leonard shifted his stance as if shielding me without making it obvious, and nudged me forward with a gentle pressure. We stepped carefully over a fallen log, and that's when I spotted something half buried beside it. A strip of red fabric frozen stiff, attached to a zipper. It looked like part of a winter jacket. Small, worn down, smeared with dirt as if it had been there a long time. Leonard didn't let me stop to examine it. He just murmured for me to keep moving, his voice tighter than before. The unease wrapped around us like a second layer of cold, and every distant creak in the forest started sounding like a warning. We reached a point where the trail split into two faint paths, one we came from, and another that veered left toward a cluster of younger trees. Leonard hesitated for a moment, glancing between them. That pause stretched longer than it should have, and I realized he was listening intently, trying to locate the stranger by sound alone. Then something soft hit the snow behind us, a light thud, followed by the rustle of branches settling. Leonard made his decision instantly. He guided me down the path to the left, one we'd never taken before, hoping it would lead us around and back toward the cabin from the opposite direction. The deeper we went, the more the terrain sloped, making it harder to stay balanced on the thick snow. I could sense Leonard calculating every turn, every noise, as if replaying years of walking this land in his head. Still, the steady pattern of footsteps kept tracing us, distant but deliberate, like the stranger didn't care about leaving tracks anymore. The farther we moved from the shelter, the more the forest pressed in, branches low enough to brush our shoulders and scrape against our sleeves. My breath grew uneven, forming brief clouds that drifted upward and vanished. Leonard finally whispered that he'd noticed something earlier, Small changes around the cabin that he'd been dismissing as wildlife. Wood moved near the shed, scraps of food left in strange places, footprints that melted before he could check them properly. He hadn't wanted to worry anyone on Christmas, but now everything fit together too cleanly. The stranger hadn't stumbled onto our land. They'd settled in, hidden in plain sight, inches from where we lived. As we followed the slanted path, a sharp crack echoed from behind us, louder than any before. Leonard didn't say a word, but the way his jaw tightened told me he knew we were running out of time to stay unnoticed. The slope leveled out near a cluster of old birch trees where the snow thinned, exposing patches of brown, frozen earth. Leonard slowed our pace even more, scanning for any sign that we were near the main trail back to the cabin. The air felt heavier here, almost muffled, like the forest had tucked itself inward. Then he noticed something partially hidden under a sheet of ice near one of the tree roots, a metal tin, the kind people use to store matches or small supplies. He nudged it gently with his boot, and the lid shifted just enough for us to see what was inside. Folded scraps of newspaper lined with notes scribbled in pencil, most of them smeared and warped by moisture. One of the visible phrases mentioned a weathered cabin on the ridge, and another, barely legible, described movement near the east window. Leonard didn't let me read further. He pushed the tin back under the ice with a controlled motion, as if returning it to where it belonged, and whispered that we needed to get home as quietly as possible. We moved again, weaving between the birches, heading toward a ridge that would give us a view of the cabin if we could get high enough. The wind picked up in sudden bursts, carrying dry flakes that stung as they hit our faces. Leonard kept glancing upward, as if judging whether the stranger had climbed the ridge before us. I kept listening for footsteps, but the wind scrambled every sound, turning the forest into a swirl of shifting noises. Just as we reached the base of the ridge, something metallic clinked behind us, faint but unmistakable. Leonard tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack and motioned for us to climb fast, but quietly. We dug our boots into the snow, pushing upward while trying not to send loose chunks rolling downhill. Halfway up, I spotted a dark shape at the bottom of the slope, motionless, angled slightly as if watching the path we had just taken. Leonard whispered for me not to stop, and we kept climbing until the ridge finally opened into a flatter stretch of ground. From the top, the cabin was visible through a patch of thinner trees, its chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke. Seeing it should have made me feel safer, but the distance between us and it felt larger than ever, as if every inch of the forest between was waiting for the stranger's next move. Leonard crouched low, checking the tree line below for any sign of the figure. After a moment, he leaned closer and murmured that running the rest of the way might draw too much attention. But walking gave the stranger time to intercept us. Neither option felt right. The wind dipped for a moment, and in that brief silence we heard a new sound. A soft, steady tapping coming from behind a stand of pines farther down the ridge. Not loud, not hurried, just an eerie, rhythmic knock, like someone using a stick against a tree trunk. Leonard's jaw tightened again, and he motioned for us to move toward the right side of the ridge, where the trees were denser and the ground sloped gently enough to descend without sliding. We slipped into the thicker cover, branches brushing against our arms and coats, the smell of pine sharp in the cold air. Leonard whispered that the tapping was intentional, a way of alerting us or guiding us. Either idea made my chest tighten. We moved downhill in slow steps, trying to keep our silhouettes hidden among the trees. Every few yards, another faint knock echoed from a different direction, as if the stranger was circling, pushing us away from certain areas. By the time we reached the lower stretch of the hill, the sound had stopped entirely, replaced by the soft whisper of snow drifting from branches overhead. The cabin was only a short walk away now. Leonard turned to me, his expression calm but intensely focused, and told me that as soon as we reached the open field behind the shed, we would make a straight dash for the back door and lock everything behind us. Before he could say more, a dark figure stepped briefly into view between two distant rows of trees, just long enough for us to know the stranger wasn't finished with us yet. Leonard barely gave me time to process the sight before he tapped my arm and guided me forward, keeping our pace slow until we reached the edge of the trees. The snow in the open field looked untouched, smooth, pale, and almost too perfect. He paused for a breath, scanning the woods behind us as if trying to calculate how far the stranger might be. Then he leaned in close and murmured that once we stepped into the field, there'd be no cover and no room to hesitate. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud enough that it felt like it might give us away. He counted under his breath, just a short, steady rhythm, and on the last beat, we broke from the tree line. The cold air hit harder without the forest blocking the wind, and every step felt agonizingly loud, crunching through the crusted snow. I didn't dare look back, but I could sense movement at the edge of the woods, like a shadow shifting against darker shadows. We were halfway across the field when a sharp crack echoed from the tree line behind us, louder than anything we'd heard all morning. Leonard reached back, lightly touched my elbow, and told me to keep going no matter what. The cabin grew clearer with each step. The faded boards, the small wreath Grandma had hung on the door, the old sled propped beside the porch. For a moment, the sight almost grounded me, but the sound of sprinting footsteps behind us shattered any thought of safety. Leonard didn't turn around. He just urged me forward, pushing through the final stretch of snow. When we reached the back steps, he swung the door open, practically pulling me inside before shutting it with a force that rattled the window panes. The lock clicked into place, followed by the heavy slide of the wooden bar he rarely used. Outside, the footsteps slowed, then stopped altogether, settling into a silence that felt unreal. Inside the cabin, everything looked exactly as it had that morning. The tree lights still glowing, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, but the warmth that usually made the space feel alive now felt thin and uncertain. Leonard motioned for me to stay away from the windows while he grabbed the old radio to call a neighbor who helped with security on larger properties. As he spoke in low, clipped words, I moved closer to the wall, listening for any sign that the stranger was still nearby. Minutes passed with no sound, no footsteps, no tapping, nothing. When the neighbor finally arrived, he circled the property with Leonard while I watched anxiously from the living room. They returned after a long stretch, both carrying that stiff, serious look adults get when they can't make sense of something. The only tracks they found were our own. No sign of the stranger, no trace of the hide, not even the path we followed earlier. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything the moment we ran. For weeks after that day, Leonard kept a closer eye on the property, checking the far corners of the land before sunrise and again at dusk. Nothing unusual ever turned up. No new footprints, no tapping, no makeshift shelter hidden beneath the spruce trees. Eventually, life settled back into its normal rhythm. But every Christmas morning I still catch myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see a figure standing between the branches, waiting. Leonard has his own way of coping. He keeps the wooden bar across the back door year-round now, even in the summer. We never talked much about what we saw or the person who watched us from the woods. But every so often, when the air gets cold enough and the forest quiets just a little too deeply, I remember the hidden tin, the notes about our cabin, and the calm, measured way the stranger followed us. And even though nothing ever happened after that day, I've never shaken the feeling that he left because he chose to, not because he was gone for good. Late December of 2022 had a strange rhythm to it, and I remember that year clearly, because our place felt heavier than usual even before anything scary happened. My name is Elliot, and at the time I was juggling odd jobs around the property while my wife, Marianne, handled most of the holiday planning. We lived far from town on a stretch of land bordered by woods on one side and an old cemetery on the other, a cemetery so small and forgotten that even locals barely mentioned it. Our closest neighbor lived a 15-minute drive away, so the quiet was something we'd grown used to. That Christmas Eve started like any other, cold air drifting through the cracks of the old farmhouse, the smell of pine from the tree Marianne insisted on cutting herself, and the sound of our two kids arguing upstairs over something trivial. Nothing in that morning hinted that by nightfall I'd question whether we were really safe out there. The day moved slowly, the way winter days do when the sun barely clears the treetops. I kept glancing out the kitchen window toward the cemetery, noticing how the gravestones looked sharper than usual under the thin layer of frost. There was a shed back there, one the groundskeeper used decades ago, but no one maintained that place anymore. Every time I caught sight of it, I felt a kind of pressure in the back of my mind, like my brain wanted me to pay attention to it without explaining why. Marianne teased me for staring outside so much, but I couldn't shake the sense that the tree line felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. Even the usual crows that perched on the fence posts stayed away. By late afternoon, that odd stillness stretched across the yard until it felt like the world was waiting for something. Night settled abruptly, the kind that swallows everything at once, and we turned on the old string lights around the living room. The kids were already wired with excitement for Christmas morning, but I kept drifting toward the front window, checking the porch more times than I want to admit. That house had its quirks, boards that shifted in the cold, the occasional creak of the staircase, but none of the noises we heard that night belonged to the house. The first sound hit around 9, slow, deliberate steps crossing the porch, not quick like an animal, not light like someone passing by. Each step pushed down hard, pausing just long enough to feel intentional. Our dog, Jasper, lifted his head from the rug and stared at the door without making a sound, which put me even more on edge. He wasn't the kind of dog to stay quiet when strangers approached. Marianne looked at me, expecting me to go check, but before I could reach the entryway, something tapped the living room window. 3 sharp knocks, spaced evenly, like someone signaling instead of begging for attention. The kids went silent upstairs. Even the warm glow from the Christmas lights felt wrong after that sound, too soft compared to the sudden pressure pulsing around the house. I reached for the back door instead of the front, thinking maybe someone needed help or got lost. But when I stepped onto the porch, the yard stretched out empty. Not a footprint, not a shadow, nothing moving between the gravestones. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the quiet that followed, because deep down I knew that knock hadn't been a mistake or a stray branch. Someone had approached our home on Christmas Eve, and they wanted us to know it. The hours after that first knock dragged by in a way that made the house feel smaller, like the walls were quietly bending inward. We put the kids to bed early, pretending everything was fine, though they kept asking why Jasper wouldn't leave the hallway. He sat facing the front door with an intensity I'd never seen in him. Marianne tried to keep herself busy, folding blankets, checking the stove twice, rearranging ornaments on the tree. But every few minutes she'd glance toward the windows as if expecting another tap. Around midnight, just when we started thinking maybe the intruder had moved on, a heavy thud hit the roof hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Another came right after, longer, like something, or someone, dragged a boot across the shingles. We didn't move or speak. Even Jasper pressed himself lower to the floor. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the back porch again, this time determined to catch whoever was playing these mind games. The cold felt sharp enough to bite through my jacket, but what unsettled me more was the absolute stillness of the yard. Not a breeze, not a sound of nighttime animals, not even the distant hum of a passing car. I aimed the light across the roofline but saw nothing. The cemetery, however, caught my eye. A faint glint flickered near the old shed, like metal catching the moonlight. It vanished as fast as it appeared, but it was enough to make my pulse throb in my ears. I considered waking the kids and taking everyone to the truck, but the idea of stepping away from the house while someone lurked nearby felt reckless. So I locked up every door and window and waited. Morning arrived as if nothing had happened, sunlight touching the frost-covered fields like the world had reset. The kids ran downstairs ready for presents, completely unaware of the fear that had soaked into the night before. Marianne and I exchanged glances, both silently debating whether we should pack up and leave for a couple of days. But we didn't want to ruin Christmas. We convinced ourselves it had been an animal or the wind. even though the explanations felt flimsy. I walked out to check the property again in daylight. No footprints around the house, no debris on the roof, no sign of anyone passing through. But when I looked toward the cemetery shed, something inside me tightened. Not fear exactly, but something close to dread. The shed door, which was always swollen shut from years of weather, now hung slightly open. Curiosity pushed me across the field, despite every instinct telling me to stay away. The shed sat crooked, leaning to one side like it was trying to slip back into the earth. The padlock was snapped clean, and that alone made me stop. I pulled the door wider and saw what had been hidden from us for who knows how long. A pile of blankets arranged in a nest-like shape, empty food cans, a coffee mug with chipped blue paint, a small notebook, the cover warped from moisture. It was clear someone had been living there, sleeping there, watching the cemetery, and from the angle of the dusty window watching our house. The thought of someone spending nights barely a few hundred feet from where my kids slept made me feel lightheaded. But what truly rattled me was the small trail of boot prints leading from the shed, straight toward our porch steps. Prints that were fresh. I backed away from the shed, trying to make sense of how long this person had been hiding out there. The boot prints cut a direct line through the frosted grass, stopping right at the edge of our porch as if the intruder had stood there, studying the house before approaching it. When I returned inside, Marianne saw my expression and immediately gathered the kids in the living room. I told her what I'd found, and for the first time since we'd moved out there, she suggested calling someone, anyone, for help. But the nearest deputy wouldn't reach us quickly, and the idea of waiting around while the person could still be on the property made all of us uneasy. We decided to stay together in the living room until nightfall, locking every door, keeping the curtains drawn, and trying to pretend we weren't listening for something to return. As darkness settled, the house adopted that strained silence we'd heard the night before, an unnatural kind of quiet that felt as if the whole property were bracing for impact. We sat with the TV on low volume, trying to distract the kids with old Christmas movies. Jasper paced the length of the room, stopping every so often to sniff the bottom of the front door. Then, right around the same time as the previous night, sharp steps landed on the porch, slow, spaced, purposeful, not rushing, not hesitant, just steady. The knocking came next, but not on a window this time. 3 solid taps directly on the front door, as if whoever stood outside expected us to open it willingly. The kids huddled against Marianne, and I motioned for everyone to stay quiet. Whoever was out there waited, listening. I crept toward the mudroom where the old hunting rifle was stored. I hadn't fired it in years, but the weight of it in my hands offered a small sense of control. I moved carefully to the side window and angled myself enough to get a glimpse of the porch. That's when I finally saw him. A man stood facing the door, thin, wearing a heavy jacket that looked 2 sizes too big, and holding a lantern with a cracked glass pane. His face was partly hidden by a scarf pulled high on his cheeks, but his eyes were fixed on the house with an intensity that churned my thoughts. I didn't confront him. Instead, I shouted that I was armed and calling the authorities. The moment the words left my mouth, he broke into a frantic run, cutting across the yard toward the cemetery as if he knew the terrain better than we did. I chased him only far enough to ensure he was really leaving. By the time I reached the field, he'd vanished behind the shed. We packed up that same night and drove to Marianne's sister's house, refusing to spend another minute out there until someone checked the cemetery grounds. Deputies later found signs of long-term shelter, food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and footprints matching the ones on our porch, but no trace of the man himself. They suggested he was drifting through the area, using the abandoned shed whenever winter hit. We moved out the following spring. Even now, during quiet nights, I still replay those knocks in my head. I don't know why he targeted our home, why he returned each Christmas Eve, or what he might have done if we hadn't spoken up. All I know is that the silence around that cemetery was never truly empty. Most years, the holiday season used to be the only time our office felt remotely warm. I'd been working there for about 3 years, handling invoicing and vendor emails, nothing remarkable, just predictable enough to give a strange comfort. During December, though, the whole place shifted. Fake garlands taped to cubicles, cheap cookies on every surface, and people pretending they liked each other more than they actually did. I remember arriving at the Christmas party that night with the usual mix of reluctance and politeness, trying to blend in without attracting attention. I talked to a few coworkers, grabbed a plastic cup of punch, and kept my distance from the louder groups. Everything felt routine, until I realized someone had been watching me from across the room, too still compared to the chaos around him, as if he were memorizing every small thing I did. This coworker, his name was Rowan, had always been a little intense, though nothing you'd report. The kind of person who spoke quietly but stared too long, who remembered details you barely recalled telling him. He wasn't assigned to my team, so interactions were usually brief. A nod in the break room, an occasional comment about work. I used to chalk up his oddness to social awkwardness, something harmless. But that night, the way he hovered near the snack table with that fixed attention made the back of my neck tighten. When I moved, he shifted. When someone blocked his view, he tilted his head until he had a clear line again. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt a steady pressure building, like being monitored too closely in a room full of people pretending everything was festive. At some point, I stepped away from the main area to get fresh air near the hallway where the office stored decorations and spare chairs. It was quieter there, dimmer, the kind of place no one lingered long because the overhead light buzzed faintly. I figured I'd take a minute, check a few messages, and return once my energy reset. I hadn't been there more than 10 seconds when footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. Before I could turn fully, Rowan stood at the entrance of the hall, blocking the only exit. He smiled in a way that made the whole moment feel staged, rehearsed even. Then he started talking rapidly, saying he just needed a private moment, and that he'd been trying to talk to me for weeks. His voice had a strange rhythm, like he'd practiced every sentence until it lost any normal tone. I told him we could talk out in the open with everyone else, but he stepped closer, narrowing the space. The hallway felt tighter than it should have been, the walls reflecting each sound in a hollow echo. I remember the smell of cinnamon candles drifting from the party mixing with something sharp on his breath, and how wrong those scents felt together. When he reached for my arm, I backed up until my shoulder hit a metal shelf. He kept talking about connection, and how the party was a perfect chance. I didn't shout, but something in my voice must have carried, because 2 people from HR came around the corner at the exact moment he tried to corner me again. They pulled him back, whispering tense instructions, and let him out while he stared at me like the interruption was the real violation, not what he'd been doing. They told me later that night that he'd been warned about boundary issues with another employee earlier that year, but nothing had ever escalated enough to involve the police. HR made it sound like a misunderstanding, something they could manage internally. I remember sitting at one of the empty tables while people awkwardly avoided looking in my direction, the music still playing like nothing had happened. One of the HR reps, her name was Lillian, kept insisting that Rowan would be escorted out and sent home. She promised me he wouldn't return to work until they sorted everything out. That phrasing stuck with me because sorted everything out felt vague, too gentle for the situation. Later, I learned he'd resigned the very next morning, which was supposed to be reassuring. It didn't help much. The first few days after the party were quiet, almost dull in comparison. Work moved on, people pretended not to remember the scene, and I tried to convince myself that Rowan leaving the company meant the entire situation had ended. I even decorated my apartment a bit just to feel normal again. Small string lights on the mantle, a scented candle I barely burned, but I kept replaying the moment he blocked the hallway, the strange mix of determination and entitlement in his expression. At night, I'd catch myself double-checking the lock before bed, not because I expected anything to happen, but because my mind refused to let the memory settle. That tension stayed with me, a quiet current running under every routine task. 3 days after his resignation, I left for work early and noticed something tucked under the mat outside my apartment door. At first, I thought it was a flyer, or maybe a delivery note. It was a piece of lined notebook paper folded twice, the corners pressed sharply as if someone had taken their time with it. Inside, the handwriting leaned heavily to the left, small and compressed, the ink darker at certain points like the pen had been held too tightly. He wrote about the hallway, that moment, as if it had been a mutual understanding cut short by meddling people. He described watching me leave the office that night, following at a distance because he needed to be sure. I got home safely. I read the note 3 times, each pass making the words sink deeper until the fear turned from abstract to something solid. I called the police, of course. They came, took photos, and asked the usual questions. One of the officers suggested I might want to stay with a friend for a few nights just in case. Another mentioned that without a direct threat, there wasn't much they could legally do beyond filing a report. Their presence helped, but only while they were standing there. Once they left, the apartment felt too quiet, too exposed despite the locked windows. I kept thinking about how he'd known which door was mine, how long he'd been outside before slipping the note under the mat. That night, I slept on the couch with the TV on low volume, not because I expected to wake up to something terrible, but because silence made every small sound feel like it had a purpose behind it. 2 days later, another note appeared, this time on the inside of my building's front entrance, wedged between the metal frame and the glass. I hadn't seen anyone outside when I left for work, but the paper was dry despite the light rain that morning, which meant he'd likely placed it early, maybe before sunrise. This one was longer, written in the same tight handwriting, but the tone shifted. He wrote about leaving the company as if it had been a sacrifice he made for our future interactions, a phrase that made my chest tighten in a way I can still recall perfectly. He mentioned details about my commute that I'd never shared with him, like the small shortcut I took behind a row of townhouses to avoid traffic. He wrote that he'd walked the same path, wanting to understand the rhythm of my mornings. Reading that line made the hallway outside my apartment feel unnaturally still, like the building itself was waiting for my next move. I gave that note to the police as well. They took it more seriously than the first one, especially when I explained that Rowan had never known where I lived. One of the officers recommended adding a security camera, and I did it that same afternoon. The installation guy chatted while he worked, joking about holiday deliveries and porch pirates, totally unaware of how badly I needed the distraction. When the camera finally clicked on, showing the feed on my phone, I felt a fragile sense of control return, thin, but better than nothing. That night I watched the live feed more than I watched the actual TV. Every passing car made my nerves tense, but the camera stayed fixed on the same empty patch of concrete outside my door, offering a kind of uneasy reassurance. The final note showed up 4 days later and it wasn't left outside. I found it inside my mailbox, mixed in with store coupons and a utility bill. The envelope wasn't sealed, just folded at the flap. He wrote that he understood things had been misinterpreted and that he wasn't planning to interrupt my routine anymore. The phrasing was calm, almost polite, which somehow felt more disturbing than the earlier messages. At the end, he wrote one last line, short, uneven, as if written quickly. "This was never supposed to scare you." That sentence stayed with me more than anything else, because it revealed a kind of certainty on his part, a belief that he'd been justified the whole time. But the part that really unsettled me was the timestamp he'd scribbled at the bottom, 4:12 a.m. That meant he'd been near my building in the middle of the night, close enough to place the note quietly without waking anyone. After that, everything stopped. No more notes, no more sightings, no unexpected sounds in the hallway that made me hesitate before checking the peephole. The police increased patrols near my street for a week, and the camera never picked up anyone matching his description. Weeks passed without incident, then months. Life slowly rearranged itself into something that resembled normal. But I still think about those notes, especially the last one. People assume the worst part is the fear you feel in the moment. But it's not. It's realizing how easily someone can step into your life, how quietly they can observe, and how their disappearance leaves a different kind of silence behind, one that never quite feels honest. Even now, every December, I catch myself checking the hallway before unlocking my door, half expecting another folded piece of paper waiting for me.